I transmigrated. One moment I was a perfectly ordinary person in a perfectly ordinary world, and the next I was standing inside a cultivation realm that operated on rules I had spent exactly 0 time preparing for. The universe, apparently, had a sense of humor. But the cruelest joke wasn't the transmigration itself. It was what came with it. Because somehow, against all odds and every reasonable expectation, I had managed to become the disciple of the most feared woman in the entire cultivation world. Her name was Ling Qingxue, 3,000 years old, cultivation base that made senior practitioners faint from proximity alone, and a reputation so terrifying that even the so-called righteous sects, the ones who spent their days announcing their own virtue, lowered their voices when they said her name. They called her the #1 Demoness of the cultivation path. They had tried to destroy her 17 times across the centuries, and failed 17 times. And those failures had added 17 layers of grudging, furious respect to the fear. She was invincible. She was eternal. She was the kind of person who exists in stories specifically to remind you how small you are. And then her 9 disciples betrayed her. All of them. All 9, in one coordinated, devastating act of collective treachery that I could not have imagined if I'd tried. They didn't just leave. They struck. They struck when she was vulnerable. They combined everything they had, and they brought the entire edifice of her sect crashing down around her. The buildings fell. The formations broke. The centuries of accumulated power were torn apart at the foundations. And Ling Qingxue, 3,000 years of legend, 3,000 years of being the thing that cultivation world nightmares were made of, was left crumpled in the ruins of her own great hall, barely breathing, her cultivation base shattered beyond recognition, every connection between her spirit and the foundational meridians severed at the root. I found her there. I didn't know what else to do, so I didn't leave. That was it. That was the entire scope of my heroism. I stayed. I held her up. I made sure she was still breathing. And somehow, in the calculus of someone who had been betrayed by 9 people she had invested centuries in, the act of a single person with garbage spiritual roots simply not abandoning her was enough to matter. She looked at me from her position against the collapsed remains of her ceremonial bed, eyes half-focused, spirit scattered, and I could see her calculating even through the haze of pain. She was assessing me the way she assessed everything, systematically, without sentiment. She knew what I was. My spiritual roots were the kind that made sect elders shake their heads and gently suggest that perhaps farming was a more suitable vocation. Every standard measure of cultivation aptitude I possessed was firmly in the bottom tier. In any normal circumstance, a person like me would never have been allowed within 100 meters of someone like her, let alone accepted as a formal disciple. And yet, there I was, and there she was, and I was the only one who had stayed. She closed her eyes. I didn't leave. That was enough. I came to her side the moment she began to stir, moving forward before I'd consciously decided to move. I'd been watching her face for a flicker of returning consciousness, and the moment it came, I was already there, kneeling beside her, my voice coming out more urgent than I'd intended. I told her not to worry. I told her that whatever those 9 had done to her, whatever it had cost, I was going to repay it for her. Every single blow, every indignity, all of it. I would collect it back from them and lay it at her feet, multiplied. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to be unmoved by well-intentioned promises from people with no ability to back them up. She said with the precise flatness of absolute authority, even in a completely wrecked body, "You can't even break through the first level of body tempering. Stop making declarations you can't support." I was about to argue when she stopped me with a look. She was in too much pain to waste energy on this. She told me to go to the back chambers. I went. I carried her there first because she couldn't walk, and that involved physical circumstances I was not emotionally prepared for. She was lighter than her presence suggested, and warmer. And when her weight settled against me, I forgot temporarily how to operate my own hands. Ling Qingxue had spent 3,000 years cultivating at the peak of a path that prioritized the spirit over the body, which meant that in the actual physical sense, she was a woman in her early 20s, the cultivation having suspended the passage of time in her flesh long ago. She was also, objectively, the most beautiful person I had ever seen in either of my lifetimes. I found this fact significantly inconvenient in that specific moment. I carried her carefully, with hands positioned at the most professionally appropriate locations I could identify, and concentrated very hard on not thinking about anything. I got her to the bed. I set her down. I sat on the edge and looked at my hands for a moment and tried to remember what a normal thought felt like. When I looked up, she was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something between calculation and the faintest trace of something else. I asked about her injuries. She told me, quietly and without drama, that the 9 disciples had destroyed her meridional foundation. Not just damaged it, destroyed it. Without a foundation, cultivation could not rebuild. Her power, her lifespan, all of it depended on a structural base that no longer existed. I asked if there was a way to fix it. She told me about the Heavenly Dao, a mythological phenomenon, something that existed in ancient texts and nowhere else, a manifestation of universal order that descended upon the world in response to someone whose sincere conviction was powerful enough to move heaven itself. In thousands of years of cultivation history, no one had ever confirmed seeing one with their own eyes. Theoretically, a Heavenly Dao could restore any damage. Theoretically. She told me this the way you tell someone a fairy tale, informative but completely detached from any expectation of practical relevance. She told me to go. I told her I would get her one. She looked at me with the expression adults use on children who announce they're going to move the moon. She told me to go again. I went. Back in my own quarters, I opened the cultivation manual she had transmitted to me, the Chaos Body Tempering Formula. Every single character in it was legible. Every sentence parsed into syntactical sense. The moment I tried to apply any of it to actual cultivation, my brain simply stopped cooperating. It was like trying to hold water with open hands. I was in the middle of my 4th failed attempt when a sound arrived in my mind that I had never heard before. Mechanical, clear, with the tone of something activating from a long sleep. System initialization complete. A single check-in per day, available at any location, with different locations yielding different effects. I took exactly 2 seconds to process this before triggering the check-in. Congratulations on triggering a special location effect. The first chaos chi of this world's primordial formation. Reward, fully automated cultivation avatar. Fusion available. The avatar, if accepted, would integrate with my physical form and handle all cultivation processes on my behalf. Continuous, uninterrupted, 24 hours a day without requiring any active attention from me. I read this notification 3 times to make sure I hadn't misunderstood it. I had not misunderstood it. I accepted immediately. The fusion was seamless. One moment I was sitting on the floor with a manual I couldn't parse, and the next I could feel something running beneath the surface of my body like a current. Quiet, steady, unceasing. Cultivation happening in the background while the rest of me was free to do anything else. I stood up, put down the manual, and sprinted directly to my master's chamber. I announced, before she'd fully registered my presence, that I wanted to learn sword techniques. Ling Qingxue opened her eyes and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has just been interrupted by a very enthusiastic problem. She explained with deliberate patience the fundamental principle. Sword techniques came after body tempering. Body tempering came first. That was the sequence. When I had entered the first level of body tempering, she would transmit a technique. Until then, go practice. The conversation was over. I told her I had already entered first level body tempering. The silence that followed was specific. Not the silence of someone considering a response, but the silence of someone whose internal model of reality has just been quietly contradicted. She told me to come closer. She examined my cultivation level through direct spirit sense contact. She examined it again. She sat back and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Genuine, unguarded surprise. She asked how. I told her I had cultivated. This answer was technically complete and practically useless. She ordered me out with the energy of someone who needs to think without an audience. I went. The next 2 days I went to the back mountain. I needed to test what I had, and theory was a poor substitute for real contact with something that wanted to kill me. I found a spirit boar almost immediately. Enormous, red-eyed from days of eating fermented fruit, with the aggressive disorientation of something that had lost the ability to calculate risk. I didn't go at it directly. I circled it, found the angle where its blind side met its center of mass, and hit it once with the iron training weight I was carrying. The sound of impact was tremendous. The boar went down without a twitch. I stood there for a solid 5 seconds, recalibrating my sense of my own physical capability. First level body tempering, applied cleanly, was substantially more effective than its position at the absolute bottom of the cultivation progression implied. I dragged the boar back to the sect, gathered wild vegetables on the walk back, and spent 2 hours making a pork and vegetable congee. The plan was straightforward. Food, then gratitude, then hopefully the conversation about techniques would go better than it had. Old wisdom. Someone who's eaten your cooking is marginally less likely to dismiss you. I arrived at my master's door and waited, and waited. The congee went from hot to warm. I knocked again. Nothing. I pushed the door open and found her collapsed sideways on the meditation bed, unconscious. The panic that arrived in me in that moment was not the measured analytical variety. It was the immediate physical kind that supersedes thought entirely. I was beside her before I'd made a decision to move. I called her name twice, 3 times, louder each time. On the 5th call, her eyelids moved. On the 8th, they opened, slowly, without focus, and then with gradual clarity. The first thing she saw when her vision oriented was my face, which I can only assume was not a reassuring visual given that I had apparently been crying with sufficient thoroughness to produce visible evidence. Her eyes fixed on the tear tracks on my face. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Put me down." I was holding her up. She had gone limp as consciousness returned, and I had caught her automatically. I helped her to sitting, keeping one hand at her back because she was still listening. She said very quietly, "I'm fine." I said, "You were unconscious." She said briefly. I said, "What if I hadn't come when I did?" She had no answer for that. I didn't push it. I held her upright and let the panic settle. When she was stable enough to sit without support, she began to push herself upright. She managed half the motion, and then her arms gave out completely, and the resulting momentum shift brought her against me in a way that was not planned and produced a brief period of proximity that neither of us had any protocol for. We ended up side by side on the meditation bed, her shoulder against my arm, close enough that I could hear her breathe. The proximity did something to the atmosphere of the room that I didn't know how to name. I could feel my own heartbeat more than usual. she said after a moment in a voice that was slightly rougher than her usual. "Your heartbeat is quite loud." I said, "You collapsed in front of me. I think the loud heartbeat is justified." She almost said something. She stopped. Then she said something about qi and blood circulation following rapid recovery, a purely medical explanation offered with academic precision and perfect composure. I accepted it completely and thought about something else very hard. I got the kanji from the table and offered it to her. She ate without comment. By the time the bowl was empty, she had more color. She looked at the empty bowl for a moment. She said, "I'll transmit a sword technique." I said, "I would appreciate that." She told me to sit in front of her. She pressed one finger to the center of my chest and closed her eyes, and through that single point of contact she transmitted the swift thunder sword art, a technique obtained from a secret realm, scaling with the user's cultivation, allowing movements of extraordinary speed at even the most basic level, and carrying the concentrated force of lightning strikes at higher cultivation. Every form arrived with crystalline clarity, not information to memorize, but something that settled directly into muscle and instinct, bypassing the normal learning process. When she withdrew her finger, I sat still with my eyes closed and ran through the forms in my mind, finding them perfect and complete. When I opened my eyes, she was white, completely drained, hands pressed flat against the bed, breathing controlled in the specific way that indicates willpower substituting for capacity. Technique transmission at her level cost cultivation she couldn't afford to spend. She had spent it on me anyway. I grabbed her hands and didn't let go and told her she was not allowed to do things like that without warning me. She looked at my face, at the wet quality my eyes had acquired again, and said something in her expression shifted. She touched my face for a moment, just lightly, and told me to go cultivate. I left. I stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about the weight of her hand on my face, and concluded I was in significant personal danger of a non-combat variety. The next 2 weeks, I practiced without interruption. The automated avatar ran its steady background process through every hour while I worked the swift thunder forms in the open courtyard space, until they stopped being something I was performing and became something I simply was. The speed the technique generated was extraordinary, movements that seemed to bypass the normal relationship between thought and action. After a week, I was executing the first 3 forms without conscious attention. After 2 weeks, I was finding combinations between the forms, the spaces where named techniques flowed into unnamed transitions, discovering that the real depth of a sword art lives not in the moves themselves, but in the connections between them. I tested against spirit beasts in the back mountain daily, pushing the limits of what I could currently do so that the limits would expand. I came back each evening and made food and brought some to my master's door. Sometimes she answered immediately. Sometimes she waited, and the waiting felt deliberate, like she needed to gather something before she opened the door. I didn't comment on this. I just left the food and went back to practice. The system's chain completion notification arrived on an ordinary morning without fanfare. A major milestone reward was available. A Heavenly Dao Fruit, the physical manifestation of universal principle, sufficient to restore any cultivation base, regardless of the extent of damage. I read this notification 6 times. Then I sat very still for a while and thought about what it would mean. Then I went to the back mountain and spent 4 consecutive hours pushing every limit I had, running the most difficult beast territories I had mapped, using the swift thunder sword art's most advanced sequences against things that were genuinely trying to kill me. The system registered the completions. The reward dropped. I held the fruit in both hands, and it was warm and radiant and felt like something that had been waiting to be exactly where it was. I turned to head back. 3 more spirit wolves came out of the undergrowth from 3 directions. I ran. I fought running. I fell from a tree branch, the specific moment when your foot finds air where it expected bark. I got back up. I dragged myself through underbrush with my legs torn up and one shoulder dislocated, and my hands locked around the fruit with a grip that was purely automatic by that point, because conscious will had largely gone offline in favor of one repeating thought. She needs this. She needs this. She needs this. I made it through the formation boundary at the sect's edge. Then I stopped. The ground came up. I let it. She found me. I don't know exactly what she sensed or heard. She told me later that something felt wrong, and she moved before she had fully analyzed what the feeling was. She opened her chamber door and stepped into the corridor and found me. The sight of me, the blood, the bone visible at my shoulder, the hands that were still locked around something she hadn't yet identified, broke through 3,000 years of trained composure in approximately 1 second. She said my name, and her voice sounded different from how it always had. She checked my injuries. She identified the fruit. She understood what had happened with a comprehensiveness that landed in her all at once. What I had done, what it had cost, what it meant about every conversation we'd had since the day I arrived. She healed my external wounds with the recovered cultivation she was carefully rationing. Then she sat down on the floor beside me and waited for me to come back. And while she waited, she thought about what it meant to have someone give everything for you and what she was going to do with knowing it. When I opened my eyes, she was there. The first thing I registered was that she had been crying. Not much, not dramatically, but the evidence was there in the slight redness at the outer corners of her eyes and the way she blinked once too quickly when she saw me look at her. Ling Qingxue, who had walked through 17 assassination attempts without visible distress, who had governed the cultivation world's fear for 3 centuries. She had tear tracks on her face that were specifically, demonstrably, because of me. I said, "Master," she said, "don't move." 3 ribs still mending. I said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." I said, "Your face says something else." She made a very small sound that was not quite a laugh. She said, with the specific precision of someone who has been thinking about exactly how to phrase something for some time, "I thought I was going to lose you." I lay still with that sentence sitting in the air between us. I said, "I wasn't going to let that happen." She said, "You don't always get to decide." I said, "I know, but that time I did." She reached out and took the fruit from my hands. My grip tightened automatically, even half unconscious, and she said softly, "I'll take it now." I said, "It's yours." She said, "I know." I could hear what she didn't say. "Thank you" was too small. Everything she was feeling didn't have a word for it yet. She was 3,000 years old, and she had never had someone do what I had just done, and she didn't have a category for it. She was making one. I closed my eyes again. I could feel the warmth of her sitting beside me on the floor. I thought, this is enough. For right now, this exact moment, this is enough. The Heavenly Dao Fruit's effect was immediate and overwhelming. The moment its energy entered her cultivation base, the damage reversed. Not gradually, not carefully, but with the surging completeness of something following its own natural momentum. The severed meridians reconnected. The shattered foundation rebuilt itself layer by layer, and it didn't stop at restoration. The Heavenly Dao's energy went past the damage, past the level she had occupied before, into territory she hadn't accessed in centuries, and then past that into territory no living cultivator had accessed at all. She broke through to the 4th layer of the present sky realm, then the 5th, then the 6th, the 7th. The 8th layer arrived like something clicking into its correct place. The great earth boundary, the level at which a cultivator's understanding of natural law and command over universal force both approach something that can only be called absolute mastery. her most powerful disciple, the one who had led the betrayal, who had declared himself the first under heaven, occupied the fourth layer. She now occupied the eighth. There was nothing in the world that could threaten her. There was nothing in the world that could touch the people she decided to protect. And all of it, every layer, every breakthrough, everything she had become in those few transcendent minutes, was the direct result of something a 17-year-old with garbage spiritual roots had done because he decided she was worth it. She healed my remaining injuries with hands that were steadier than they'd been in months. The precise, effortless control of someone who now had more than enough to spare. She sat beside me while the last of the mending finished, and neither of us said anything, and the ruined sect was quiet, and it was the most peaceful I had felt since arriving in this world. When I could sit up, she helped me. When I looked at her, she met my eyes directly and held them in a way she hadn't done before, something open there that wasn't usually visible. She told me what had happened to her cultivation level. She said all of it simply, the way you tell someone a fact they need to know. I looked at her while she spoke and thought, she is the most formidable thing I have ever encountered, and she has been alone inside that formidability for 3,000 years. And right now she is sitting on the floor of a ruined corridor telling me she leveled up because I nearly died for her. And she doesn't have a word for what that means to her, and I don't either, and somehow we are both fine with not having the word yet. I said, now no one can hurt you. She said, after a pause, no. And then she said, no one will hurt you either. These were two different sentences in structure, but they were the same sentence in meaning. I understood this. I let it settle. I said, I'm going to go make dinner. She said, yes, let's go inside. What followed was the strangest and most consistently pleasant stretch of my time in this world. Ling Qingxue, who my master had acquired at a cultivation assembly by the simple method of being herself in public and making it clear that his options were limited, was an alchemist of historic caliber and a person of furious pride who had decided, within approximately 10 minutes of my first proper training session, that I was specifically designed to irritate him. Old Zhang, the alchemy elder who had been swept into our household by the same net that caught Gong, was 500 years old, comprehensively knowledgeable, and had the specific energy of someone who was pretending to be more inconvenienced than he was, because admitting he was comfortable would require acknowledging that things had worked out. I cooked for all four of them. I practiced daily. I cultivated continuously via the avatar. I argued with Gong on a schedule that had become so regular it functioned as entertainment for Zhang, who had started bringing tea to watch. Gong was extraordinary at alchemy. This was the part that made everything harder. If he had been merely good, I could have maintained appropriate professional distance from his opinions about my abilities. But his output was the kind that cultivation world historians would write about. Pills refined with a precision that bypassed every limitation that normally applied, driven by a physique the system had identified as the medicinal body, a one-in-all of history trait that produced natural alchemical resonance and made his refinements absorb completely without residue, at effectiveness levels that defied conventional grading entirely. He had no idea I knew this about him. He thought my interest in him was purely strategic. He was not entirely wrong, but he was significantly underestimating the number of reasons. I called him Little Melon because I had decided that this was his designation, and because the expression it produced on his face was priceless in a way that never diminished. He called me a waste, a dead end, an inexplicable drain on resources that could have been better applied to literally any other project in the cultivation world. Some of this was technically accurate. None of it was the point. The point was that he kept showing up to the training sessions. The day I exceeded him in alchemy, even briefly, even with external assistance from the system's medicinal body experience voucher, was a moment I will remember in detail for a very long time. He had been watching me execute a refinement sequence that had previously resulted in 6 consecutive explosions, waiting with the professional patience of someone expecting catastrophe when I completed it, cleanly, correctly, with the precise timing and temperature management that he had been demonstrating for weeks, now operating through my hands as if it had always been there. He was quiet for a moment. He checked the output. He was quiet for a longer moment. He said, "How?" I said, "Practice." He looked at me with the expression of a man confronting something that offends him on a level he can't articulate. He said, "I have been practicing for 500 years. I said, "Some people learn faster." He stood up, came across the room, and kicked me with precise and moderate force. I went sideways. Zhang from his corner made a sound that was definitely not a laugh. Nangong walked back to his table, sat down, picked up his notes, and dropped a healing pill on my chest from across the room without looking. The pill was a high-grade internal restoration formula worth approximately 6,000 spirit stones on the open market. I lay on the floor, ate it, and felt my ribs uncrack in real time. Then I said, "Same time tomorrow?" He said, "Obviously." It was the closest thing to affection either of us had produced toward the other, and we both knew it, and neither of us acknowledged it. Old Zhang pulled me aside the following morning, during a moment when Nangong was occupied and couldn't overhear. He said, "I've been watching you train for weeks." He said, "I've also been watching him." I said, "And?" He said, "He came back voluntarily, you know, before your master collected him at the assembly. He was already making his way back here. He had been for months. He just didn't know how to arrive." I sat with this information. I said, "Why are you telling me this?" Zhang looked toward the window, where Nangong's silhouette was visible through the paper screen, moving with the precise economy of someone who had done nothing haphazardly since before Zhang was born. He said, "Because you're going to need to trust him soon. And it's easier to trust someone when you understand why they're here." I said, "Why are you here?" He said after a pause, "The woman I was most afraid of in 500 years of cultivation made me tea on my second morning and asked about my research." Nobody had asked about my research in 60 years. I said, "She made you tea?" He said, "With ginger. The way my mother used to make it. I don't know how she knew." He looked out the window. He said, "You should go practice." I went. I thought about a woman who had spent 3,000 years being feared and alone and still knew somehow to make ginger tea. We went on a delivery trip. Me, Nangong, and Zhang, who came because my master assigned him to come, and also because, as he freely admitted, he hadn't been outside the formation boundary in weeks, and was developing opinions about the walls. The trip was to deliver pills to my family, my father, a merchant in the mundane world, steady and tired in the way of people who have been holding things together for too long without rest. My mother was unwell. There were 8 siblings, and I was the oldest, which meant I had been assigned a category of responsibility that didn't come with instructions. The pills I had refined were for both of them, muscle-nourishing and body-tempering varieties, the best things I had been able to produce with Zhang's guidance and Nangong's reluctant corrections. Getting them there without going myself required Nangong, whose great completion cultivation level could clear any obstacle between here and there with the simple expediency of letting people see what he was. He agreed to come after approximately 45 seconds of negotiation, which I counted as a significant personal victory. The journey was 4 days each way and produced a set of memories I keep separately from everything else. Nangong resolved 2 dangerous situations without being asked and without drawing attention to the fact that he had done so. Zhang narrated the medicinal herb distribution of every terrain we passed through and was largely correct and occasionally fascinating. At night we camped in the shells of old cultivation structures, and I practiced sword forms in the dark and felt the technique continuing to develop in ways the original transmission hadn't specified. but that seemed inevitable, as if the form had been waiting for me to grow into it. On the third night, Gong told me, without preamble, that my master had described me to him before I was her disciple. He said she had explained her reason for accepting me with one sentence. "There is a boy who stayed when everyone else left." He said it was enough explanation. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, "She doesn't say things like that often." He said, "No," I said, "which is why when she does, they mean more than they would from anyone else." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." We didn't talk after that, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that happens between people who have found enough mutual understanding to stop working at it. We delivered the pills through a trusted intermediary in the nearest cultivation town, with a spirit sealing container, and a letter I had spent 3 evenings writing and rewriting. The final version was short and practical. It said the pills worked best taken with water in the morning. It said I was safe and learning. It said I thought about them. It didn't say, "I miss you," in the specific way that people miss the version of themselves that existed before something fundamental changed. It didn't say, "I am becoming something I couldn't have imagined from where I started, and the person I am becoming has been shaped by staying when I was afraid, and by making food for someone who didn't need to eat. And by the way, a woman who spent 3,000 years being feared looked at me the first time I made her laugh." These were things I would say later, when the distance had closed enough for words that large to travel safely. For now, take the pills with water. I am safe. I think about you. That was enough. We came home on the 8th day. My master was in the main courtyard when we arrived, standing still, face turned toward the path we'd come down. She had been aware of our approach for some time, and had chosen to be present rather than simply waiting inside. I noticed this. I filed it in the category of things that told me what she wouldn't say. She looked at the 3 of us. She looked at me, quick, comprehensive, confirming I was intact. And her expression did something brief and unguarded before settling back into composure. She said, "You're late." I said, "Small detour." Jiang said something about a noodle stall. Gong said nothing. My master looked at me for one more moment, and then turned and walked inside and said, "Come in. Dinner." I said, "I'll cook." She said, "I know." She had already disappeared through the door. I stood still for 1 second longer than necessary. Gong, passing me, said quietly, "She was in that courtyard for 3 hours." I said nothing. He was already inside. I stood in the fading light and thought about a woman who had lived 3,000 years maintaining appropriate distances, and had apparently spent 3 hours standing in a courtyard because the habit of appropriate distance had encountered something stronger than itself. Then I went inside and started cooking and did not think about whether my hands were shaking slightly, because they weren't. They were completely steady. That is what I will say about that. That night after dinner, she came to the courtyard where I was practicing. She stood at the edge for a moment without speaking. I finished my form and waited. She came and stood beside me. The night was clear, and the sex rebuilt formations threw soft light across the stones. Neither of us said anything for a while, which was fine. We had become people who could share silence without it requiring filling. She said eventually, "How is your father?" I said, "I think he'll be better now." She said, "Good." I looked at her. She was looking at the formation lights, expression neutral in the way that meant she was feeling something she hadn't decided what to do with. I said, "You don't have to worry about me when I leave." She said, "I'm aware that I don't have to." I said, "And yet." She said nothing. I turned to face her. She kept her eyes on the lights. I said, "I'm always going to come back." Her jaw moved. She said, "You can't promise that." I said, "I know it better than almost anything else right now." She finally looked at me. Whatever she had been holding in her expression, the careful neutrality she wore for the world, The composure that 3,000 years had made into something indistinguishable from her face. It had loosened. Just slightly. Just enough. She reached out and adjusted my collar, which had been slightly askew from training. Her fingers were precise. She said, "You should rest." I said, "Yes, master." She withdrew her hand. She looked at the lights again. She said, "I find that your absence is—" She stopped. She started again. She said, "I find increasingly that when you are not here, something is missing." That was the entire sentence. She said it with the clipped delivery of someone saying a thing for the first time and not having any template for how it should feel. I stood very still. I said, "I know what that's like." She looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us moved for a moment. Then she stepped back and folded her hands and said goodnight in a voice that was carefully even, and she walked toward the inner chambers, and I watched her go until she was out of sight. I stood alone in the quiet courtyard for a while. The formation lights hummed softly. The night was very full. I thought, whatever I arrived here as, whatever scared, confused, impossibly underqualified person landed in this world without permission or preparation, I am something else now. I am someone who stays. I am someone who came back. I am someone who made kanji and learned sword forms and called a legendary alchemist Little Melon and stood in the ruins of something terrible and decided it was worth rebuilding. I am someone a 3,000-year-old immortal waits for in a courtyard for 3 hours and calls missing when I'm gone, and she will never fully say it and I will never fully say it, and we will talk around it every day until we don't, and that is the most alive I have ever felt in either of my lifetimes. I looked up at the stars over the rebuilt sect. I thought, I would choose this. I thought, I choose this. Then I went inside, and the night closed over the courtyard behind me, and tomorrow would come with all its ordinary, extraordinary demands, and I would be ready. I had been getting ready for a while now. I think I had been getting ready from the first moment I decided to stay. 3 weeks after the delivery trip, something shifted in the rhythm of the sect that I couldn't name but could feel. The way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. My cultivation had been progressing steadily through the avatar's constant background work, and the swift thunder sword art had developed into something that I was no longer just executing but beginning to understand from the inside out. Old Zhang had stopped pretending to be irritated by my alchemy and had started occasionally referencing my work when illustrating techniques to himself, which he did in a running murmur that he seemed to forget was audible. Gong had stopped kicking me across the room when I provoked him, which either meant he was becoming more restrained or that he had started filing our arguments differently in whatever internal taxonomy he maintained for human relationships. My master had started taking tea with me in the mornings. Not every morning, not formally. She would simply appear at the table in her inner courtyard when I brought her the daily kanji, and there would be 2 cups instead of 1. And she would pour from the pot she had clearly prepared herself before I arrived, and we would sit. We talked about cultivation theory, about what I was observing in the swift thunder forms, about the heavenly Dao phenomena she had studied in texts but never witnessed. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all, just sat in the morning quiet with the tea getting gradually cooler between us, and that was fine too. It was during one of these mornings that she told me about the Cultivation Assembly, the East Wanggu Grand Assembly, the largest gathering of cultivation sects and independent practitioners in the known world, held once every 10 years. It was 3 weeks away. She was attending. I said, "Is that safe?" She looked at me with the expression she wore when I asked questions whose answers were obvious to her. She said, "I am the 8th layer of the present sky realm. Define safe." I said, "Safe for the people who try to bother you." She almost smiled. She said, "You're coming with me." I said, "I'm at the first level of body tempering." She said, "I'm aware." I said, "Is that a good idea?" She said, "Nan Gong will also attend, in his capacity as a great completion cultivator. Between the two of us, anyone who makes a decision they regret at the assembly will have excellent reasons to regret it." I accepted this logic. It was, in fact, very good logic. I asked what the assembly was for. She explained, "Resources traded, alliances forged, information exchanged." The real map of the cultivation world's power showed itself at these gatherings for anyone paying attention. She had been paying attention for 3,000 years. She knew how to read it. She was going because being absent would be read as weakness, and she was no longer weak, and she wanted the cultivation world to adjust its understanding accordingly. I said, "That makes sense." She said, "I thought it would." She poured more tea into my cup, without being asked. I looked at the cup. I looked at her. She was looking at the courtyard wall with serene calm. I drank my tea and didn't say anything, and felt something that was approximately happiness, in the specific way that happiness presents when it sneaks up on you before you've prepared a response to it. The days before the assembly, Nan Gong's behavior became notably more measured. He had always been precise. The economy of movement that came with cultivation at his level was too deeply ingrained to switch off. But there was something more considered about him in the week before we left, as if he were organizing something internal that he usually left less sorted. I caught him in the outer courtyard one evening, going through a set of cultivation forms I hadn't seen him do before. Slower than his usual movements, more deliberate, with the quality of someone revisiting something rather than practicing it. I recognized the style from a description Zhang had given me once, the foundation exercises of the school my master had led before the betrayal. He was practicing her techniques, by choice, at night, alone. I backed away quietly and said nothing about it to anyone. Some things are not meant to be witnessed and are not changed by being witnessed, and are best left in the privacy where they belong. We departed on the morning of the 15th day. Nan Gong walked ahead. I walked beside my master. Zhang stayed at the sect. He had declined with the finality of a person who had made peace with his own preferences and was no longer interested in negotiating them. He said, "I will be here when you return. I will have used the time productively." He had a stack of research texts that came to approximately his own height. I believed him entirely. As we traveled, my master moved through the world with the specific quality of someone for whom the world has learned to make accommodation. The roads cleared ahead of her. Spirit beasts that patrolled territories our path crossed retreated before we arrived. She didn't do anything. It was simply that her presence, at its current level, altered the ambient conditions of the surrounding area, in a radius that expanded with her cultivation and contracted with her intent. At 8th layer, present sky, her intent covered significant ground. We moved easily and quickly through terrain that would have taken a conventional group twice the time. And she didn't acknowledge this because for her it wasn't an achievement, it was simply what moving through the world felt like. We arrived at East Wanggu on the morning of the assembly's second day. The first day was traditionally registration and early exchanges. The second day was when the significant movement happened. The assembly grounds were enormous. A constructed plateau in the mountains, held by formation arrays for 10 centuries. Large enough to comfortably house 10,000 cultivators, and currently hosting what appeared to be most of them. The immediate impact of arriving was the weight of collective attention, the specific pressure of being observed by large numbers of people who were all very good at observation. I had been developing some tolerance for this at the sect, but this was a different order. Nan Gong walked ahead of us, and his great completion aura did the work of clearing our path in practical terms. My master walked as she always walked, at the pace of someone who had decided where she was going and was going there, without adjusting for anything in the environment. I walked on her right. The commentary arrived before we had gone 30 steps. I heard it beginning in the crowd behind us, whispers that carried the way whispers carry in spaces designed with acoustic properties, which is to say clearly and with excellent reach. The Snow Peak Mountain Demoness, the former Demoness. Look at her, someone said. Someone else said, I heard her cultivation is completely ruined. Someone said, she doesn't walk like someone whose cultivation is ruined. There was a brief debate about this. Then we passed a cluster of cultivators from one of the major righteous sects, and their elder, a man of probably 7th level present sky who had been holding court with 3 subordinates, stopped talking and turned to look, and his subordinates turned to look, and the elder said something quietly to the person beside him, and that person went slightly pale. I registered all of this without appearing to register any of it, which was a skill I had been developing via observation of my master for the past 2 months. The confrontation arrived as it was always going to arrive. Someone had decided in the comfortable mathematics of the pre-assembly rumor cycle that Ling Qingxue was weakened, was exposed, was in a position where social challenge cost little and might benefit reputation. The someone in question was a cultivator named Qi Longfang. Not someone I recognized, but clearly someone my master recognized from the way her gaze found him, with the precise anticipation of someone who had calculated approximately where the first real obstacle would be. He was at the head of a group of 7, moving with the coordinated energy of people who had arranged themselves in advance for a specific purpose. He stepped into the path ahead of us and said her name, not as a greeting, not as a question, just as a piece of information he was delivering back to her, as if he had something that belonged to her and was returning it with depreciated value. He talked. He said things about her former position and her current position, and the gap between them. His voice had the specific confidence of someone who has done the math and believes the math is correct. My master listened to all of it. She stood completely still and listened with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world, which at 8th layer, present sky, she effectively did. When he finished, she said, "Are you done?" He hadn't expected that specific response. He had expected, probably, defensiveness or deflection or the particular energy of someone navigating from weakness. He said, with somewhat less confidence than before, "You don't have the standing to speak to me that way." She looked at him. She said quietly, "When did my standing change?" And then she raised her hand. Barely. The faintest indication of intent. And the spiritual pressure that came off her was not a demonstration, was not a threat, was simply what she was. A small fraction of the 8th layer, present sky realm's actual weight made perceptible. And it hit Qi Longfang and his 6 companions like a physical force. All 7 went to their knees. The area around us in a 50-meter radius went very still. Cultivators who had been moving stopped moving. She held the pressure for exactly 5 seconds. Then she withdrew it completely. She said, "My standing is fine." She walked forward. We followed. The rest of the assembly reconfigured itself around this event, with the speed that large gatherings reconfigure around new information. By the time we had crossed the central exchange plaza, the story had reached everyone. By the time we reached the secondary halls where the real resource trading happened, people were moving differently in our vicinity. Not fearfully, not because they had been told to, but because the natural adjustment that large groups of cultivators make in the presence of genuine power had activated without being asked. Sect elders who had been carefully neutral found reasons to present themselves. Resources that would have required negotiation were offered with notable directness. My master moved through all of it with perfect economy. Yes to 2 conversations, no to 6. Precisely the exchanges that served her purposes, and not one more. I watched her work and thought about what it meant to be truly in command of a space, not by force, not by presence alone, but by the integration of both with 3,000 years of knowing exactly how the world worked and being completely indifferent to performing anything about it. It was in the late afternoon, at one of the side halls where rare formation materials were being displayed, that we encountered the event I had not anticipated. A woman, middle-aged in appearance, though certainly older in cultivation terms, was arguing with two cultivators in the uniform of a major sect. The argument was not going well for her. She had a child with her, held against her side with one arm while she gestured with the other, and the child was the color that indicates serious illness. The two cultivators were explaining, with the patient condescension of people who believe they have the structural advantage, that they could not be expected to clear a pathway through a restricted area simply because of an emergency that was technically not their sect's problem. Gong saw this before I did. He was already moving before I had fully registered the situation, not dramatically, not with any display, simply stepping forward and placing himself between the two cultivators and the woman. He didn't say anything immediately. He let his aura speak for him. The two cultivators looked at the aura and looked at each other and decided simultaneously that their business in this particular hallway had been concluded. They left. Gong looked at the child. He said to the woman, "Show me." She showed him. He examined the child with spirit sense for a moment, then removed the toxin, a complicated mixed snake variety, which he identified before she had finished explaining the symptoms, because there was nothing in the field of poisons that was beyond his knowledge. The child's color improved visibly within minutes. The woman tried to express gratitude. He directed her, firmly and kindly, to leave the area before the cultivators decided to be inconvenienced again. I had been watching all of this. My master had also been watching. She was standing very still. I glanced at her face and saw something there. Not quite the expression of someone seeing something that reminded them of a person they had known, but close to it. Something recognized. She said quietly, "Not quite to me. He hasn't changed." I said, "No." She said, "I used to think it was a flaw, that it made him vulnerable." Her voice was even. I said, "You think differently now?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I was wrong about what made people useful and what made people good, and whether those two things needed to be the same." She looked at me. She said, "He stayed because of you, you know." "Not originally. Originally, he was trying to find a path back to me, but you gave him a reason to arrive at a specific time in a specific way. You made it possible for him to come home." I didn't know what to say to this. I said, "He would have found his way back regardless." She said, "Probably, but you made it easier." She turned and walked toward the main exchange hall. I followed. Gong, coming alongside us from the direction where he'd finished ensuring the woman and child had reached safety, fell into step behind us without being asked, taking the position he always took. One step back on her left, ready, present, reliable in the specific way that people are reliable when they have decided the reliability is not conditional on reciprocation. I walked on her right. The three of us crossed the assembly grounds together, and the world we moved through adjusted itself to our presence. And the afternoon was golden, and the sect we were going back to was rebuilt, and the people who had broken it had still not been collected, but would be, and everything was moving in the correct direction. We arrived home after dark. Zhang met us at the boundary with tea already prepared, because he had apparently been aware of our return time through some combination of formation sense and the kind of intuitive domestic attentiveness that 500 years of solitary living had developed in him. He said, "Good trip?" Gong said, "Adequate." I said she made Qilong Fang kneel in the central plaza. Zhang looked at my master. He said, "Well." She said, "He recovered quickly enough." She went inside. Zhang and I stood at the boundary for a moment. He said, Gong carried a woman's unconscious child through a restricted section to the medical ward. I said, I know, I was there. He said, I know you were there. I'm saying it for the record. I said, noted. He handed me a cup of tea and went inside. I stood at the boundary for a moment in the dark and listened to the formation hum and the distant sounds of the sect settling into night, and thought about all the different kinds of strength that had been in evidence today, the kind that announced itself and the kind that didn't, the kind that accumulated over centuries and the kind that arrived in a moment of decision. They were all necessary. They worked differently. They pointed in the same direction. The final confrontation with the former disciples was still months away. I knew this the way you know the shape of the future when you can feel its approach through the present. Not specifics, not timing, but the certainty of it. The 9 who had betrayed her would have to face what they had done. They were spread across the cultivation world, some hiding behind the power of the man who had led the betrayal, some attempting to rebuild with new sect affiliations, some simply existing in the confidence that they had successfully escaped consequence. That confidence was wrong. My master's recovered and elevated cultivation meant that there was no configuration of their combined force that represented a genuine threat, and my own development, slow by cultivation world standards, relentless by virtue of the avatar that never stopped, meant that when the time came I would be ready to participate in whatever way was useful. I had made this promise to her in the ruins of her hall on the day I arrived, and I intended to keep it. Every promise I made to Ling Qingxue, I intended to keep. This was not something I had decided consciously. It was simply what happened when someone became the fixed point of your existence in a world that had otherwise been entirely uncertain. In the mornings she poured tea. In the evenings I practiced. In the hours between we cultivated and trained and argued with Gong and endured Zhang's encyclopedic narrations and rebuilt what the betrayal had broken. Not just the structures, not just the formations, but the fabric of a sect that had once been a home for 9 people who had chosen not to value it. It would be a different home now. Smaller, probably. Stranger, certainly. With an alchemist of legendary ability who expressed affection through healing pills dropped from across the room, and an elder who had been practicing secret cultivation forms in the courtyard at night, and a disciple with garbage spiritual roots and a system that never stopped running. And at the center of all of it, a woman who had survived 3,000 years and 17 assassination attempts and the most complete betrayal she had ever known, and had come out the other side at the highest cultivation level any living person had ever reached. She had come out the other side still capable of making ginger tea for a frightened elder and sitting in morning quiet with someone who had stayed. She had come out the other side still capable of standing in a courtyard for 3 hours and saying, "When I came home, you're late." That was the kind of strength the cultivation world's texts didn't have a classification for. I was learning it by proximity. I was learning it by staying, which was the only way I knew how to learn anything that mattered. The formation lights hummed. The rebuilt halls held their silence. Somewhere in the inner chambers, my master was sitting with the mirror she kept by her bed and checking something I would never ask about, because some things belonged to the 3,000 years before I arrived and would always belong there, and that was fine. What was mine was the now. The tea and the practice and the quiet mornings and the sound of someone saying my name like it was a thing worth saying. I would keep it carefully. I intended to keep it for a very long time. It was in the last week of that month that I finally broke through to the second level of body tempering. It happened during a morning check-in in my master's private cultivation chamber. She had given me access to the room for the specific purpose of check-ins, because the chamber's accumulation of 3,000 years of refined spiritual energy meant that the location bonus on check-ins there was substantial, and she was pragmatic enough to prioritize results over the awkwardness of a disciple doing system interactions in her personal space. The breakthrough itself was quiet, No explosion, no dramatic, visible surge, just a click of internal settling as the barrier between the first and second levels dissolved and the foundation rearranged itself to accommodate what it had become. I sat still for a moment, feeling the new configuration. Then I went to find her. She was in the outer courtyard with tea already made, which meant she had sensed it. She looked at me when I came through the door and said, "Second level." I said, "Yes." She said, "Sit down." I sat. She said, looking at her tea rather than at me, "You're progressing more quickly than your spiritual roots would suggest is possible." I said, "I know." She said, "I have been thinking about why." She looked at me then, directly, with the full attention she brought to things that genuinely interested her. She said, "You have a relationship with your cultivation that is different from anyone I have trained. It isn't driven by ambition or fear or external motivation. It is entirely driven by," she paused, "by the state of your heart at any given moment." Her voice was careful, clinical, the precision of someone describing something they have observed and are not yet sure what to call. I said, "What does that mean for the cultivation?" She said, "It means you will plateau when I am not well, and surge when I am safe, and stall when you are worried, and break through when you are." She stopped. She looked at her tea again. She said, "When the condition of your heart is optimal." I thought about the pattern of my breakthroughs. The first level had come after the system fusion, yes, but specifically after the morning, I had made the decision to protect her, regardless of my own limitations. The second level had come this morning, in her chamber, the morning after she had adjusted my collar in the courtyard, and said, "I find your absence is missing." I thought about this. I didn't say any of it out loud. I said, "What should I do with that information?" She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Nothing. It is simply the truth of how you cultivate. Understanding it is sufficient." She poured more tea into my cup. I watched her pour it and thought, she knows. She has known for some time exactly what the condition of my heart is and what it means for my cultivation. And she is telling me, in the only way she can tell me anything this large right now, that she is aware of it, that she has accepted the information, that she is not asking me to change it. I drank my tea. She drank hers. The courtyard was very peaceful. The sect was very alive. The future was very, very full. In the days that followed, Gong started a new project. He didn't announce it. He simply began leaving certain materials on the corner of my alchemy table. Rare ingredients, specific temperatures marked on slips of paper, combinations I hadn't attempted yet, but that corresponded to formulas I had been thinking about. When I asked him what this was, he said, "Research." I said, "Your research or mine?" He said, "I don't know yet. Work on them and find out." This was, by any standard, a significant evolution from our previous dynamic of competitive hostility, and I acknowledged it by not acknowledging it at all, which was the correct approach. I worked on the combinations. Some of them produced results that surprised me. One of them produced a result that surprised both of us. A pill variant that achieved full-body meridian clearing and advancement facilitation simultaneously, the kind of effect that would normally require 3 separate pills taken in sequence. Gong looked at the result for a long time. He said, "I don't know how you did that." I said, "The temperature on the third ingredient was wrong according to your notes." He said, "I know." I said, "So I changed it." He said, "I've been using that temperature for 60 years. I said, "Was it working?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Apparently not optimally." He picked up the pill and examined it further. He said, "We'll present this to Ling Qingxue together." I said, "All right." He said, "Don't make this strange." I said, "I'm not making it strange." He said, "You have an expression." I said, "This is just my face." He did not appear to believe this, but he let it go, which was a form of progress I was happy to accept. We presented the pill to my master that evening. She examined it. She said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at us. At both of us. Together. At the space between us where 6 weeks ago there had been nothing but friction, and was now something with a different texture. She said, "Good work." 2 words. Simple. The specific simplicity of someone who has said 2 words and meant 30. Gong and I both pretended this was a perfectly normal response, and went back to our respective activities, and neither of us mentioned that we were both slightly affected by the 2 words in a way that would have been inconvenient to admit. It was Gong who finally named what was happening at the sect. He said it over morning tea, to no one in particular, in the running commentary style he used for observations he didn't want to make eye contact with. He said, "This place was a ruin 6 weeks ago." He said, "And now it has something." He said, "I have been in cultivation for 5 centuries, and this thing it has is not something I've encountered before as a general property of sects." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think the word is home." He picked up his tea. He said, "I am noting this for the record." I said, "Noted." He said, "Don't make it strange." I said, "I'm not making it strange." He gave me approximately the same look Gong had given me and went back to his notes. I looked around the inner courtyard, at the rebuilt walls, the restored formation stones, the light that came through the windows of the inner chambers where my master was beginning another day of stabilizing her cultivation at the new level. I thought, Gong is right. This is the word. Home is not the buildings. It is the specific quality of the air when the people inside it have decided, each of them separately and then together without discussing it, that this is where they are, that this is what they are building, that what happens here matters, and they intend to be present for it. I had not had a home in this world. I had had a place to be and a task to do and a purpose to pursue, and those things had been good and necessary. But this was something else. This was the thing that the purpose was in service of. This was what the staying was for. I finished my tea. I went to find my master. She was at her window looking at the courtyard, and when she heard my footsteps she turned, and for one unguarded moment before she composed herself, I saw on her face the precise expression of someone who had been waiting without admitting they were waiting, relieved to see the person they'd been waiting for, unwilling to say so directly. She said, "You're up early." I said, "I made kanji." She said, "Again." I said, "Yes." She said, "You do that every morning." I said, "Yes." She looked at me. Something moved across her face. Amusement, warmth, something that didn't have a common name in the cultivation world's emotional lexicon, because the cultivation world, in its long history of prioritizing power over feeling, hadn't needed a word for what happens when someone who has been completely alone for 3,000 years wakes up and finds that the morning already smells like food someone made for them. She said, "Bring it inside then." I said, "Yes, master." I went to get it. She was already at the table when I came back. 2 cups of tea prepared. She poured mine first. I set down the bowl. We sat. The morning was quiet. The sect was alive. Everything that needed to be had already begun.